In this next module, we'll talk about JavaScript. We're going to start with a quick introduction into the language. We'll talk about including JavaScript in your project, and then we'll show you what jQuery is and how it can simplify some simple JavaScript usage in HTML projects. And finally, we'll introduce a tool called libman for handling package management inside of Visual Studio. Let's get started. Well, JavaScript can be used for a variety of different applications. For our needs, JavaScript is going to be the client-side language for our web applications. In the browser, the main language, the language that almost everyone uses for client-side development, is JavaScript. And that's what we're going to focus on. So JavaScript itself is object-oriented. It uses prototypical inheritance instead of classes, though in future versions of JavaScript, they are introducing classes. JavaScript is also dynamic, which means it's not typeless, but typically dynamically typed. What this means is that types can change over time, but each object itself has the notion of a type. Now, is JavaScript compiled? It is in a sense. It's compiled in the same way that actually .NET is. It's compiled just in time. But it's not using an intermediary format like MSIL or bytecode. It's actually using JavaScript as an intermediate format. So as the browser is loading your JavaScript, it's actually compiling it as it needs to execute blocks of your JavaScript code. Let's dig into JavaScript next. So let's start with a very simple JavaScript file. We're back in Visual Studio where we ended the last module. We can see our Dutch Treat project, and I've opened up the www root folder because we're going to want to create a file and a folder. So we're going to want to create a folder called JS that's going to contain a bunch of our JavaScript. And then I'm going to add a index.js. I'm just conventionally naming this the same as our HTML file. You can coordinate and name your JavaScript really in any way you want, but the .js is what signifies that it should be treated as a JavaScript file. So we'll leave that extension. And in JavaScript, we have the ability to create variables of different types. We can also use APIs that are exposed by the browser themselves. And a lot of the work in dealing with JavaScript is thinking about how you're interacting with the actual browser. One of the first things you'll find is a call called alert, and this pops up a simple message. I would really suggest not using alert much, but it's a great place to start. And so I'll just say, hello Pluralsight in my alert. JavaScript itself is loaded into the browser and then just executed. In this case, we just have code that's going to be executed. We might also define things like functions that are called later to do different things. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's see how this actually gets into the browser. If we open up our index.html file, we can drag this pretty much anywhere into the document. So there I've added it to the header. And so what the HTML document's going to do is it's going to load the CSS, it's going to load the JavaScript, and then it's going to try to draw all this code. Right now, the only thing we're having the JavaScript do is pop up an alert. Let's run this. And we can see that we're getting this hello Pluralsight before anything is actually run. And the reason this is happening is this is being executed as soon as possible. So it's actually getting in the way of the rest of our page being rendered. And then, of course, our page shows up. Let's change this into another API that's exposed called console. And it has methods to do different things. And I'm just going to say console.log. This will just write some data to the console. And this is an easy way to get warnings or other information into the console for other developers to want to work with. Let's come back. And I'm going to open up the browser tools with F12. Make sure I'm on the console. And let's refresh the page. We can see here in the console, it wrote out our hello Pluralsight, but didn't keep us from actually seeing the web page. Alert essentially blocked the rest of the work from being done in the browser until we closed it, whereas console.write simply writes to the console and keeps on trucking. But what we're more often going to want to do with the JavaScript is to interact with some part of the page. So back in our code, let's create a new variable that I'll call the form, and I want to assign to it the object on the page that is the form. So if we go back here and look at the form, there's a few ways to get this. I could go down and look for the item called form, or I could also look at the ID called the form. And that's what I'm going to do. It's not just going to be the form element. It's going to be this whole div and contents that we're going to think of as conceptually the form. And the way we do this is we first say document, because we have an HTML document, and that exposes this object called document. And it has a method called getElementById. There's also by name, by class name, by tag name, etc. But we're going to start with getElementById. And you'll notice here in Visual Studio, it's going to try and help you find the APIs that you're looking for. Though Visual Studio isn't perfect in this. When you're starting to use third-party libraries, you're going to find this isn't going to be 100% effective. But these days, it's somewhere in the 90% effective for most of the work I do. So getElementById, and I'm going to say the form. And assuming that succeeds, I should be able to do something with that form object. And in my case, I'm just going to hide it. So this is going to get the element that is the form, and then I'm going to be able to call different APIs to do things with it, like in my case, hide it. Let's go and run our page, and we'll see that here in the console, it's saying, hey, the form is null. Why is the form null? Our first indication is that getting it by ID here in the form, certainly that ID, we haven't made that mistake. So what could be wrong? The problem is that JavaScript is executed as it's being loaded. And so what we've effectively told it to do is, as you load this document, the HTML document is being loaded literally line by line, and when it gets to this, it's going to start downloading the index.js. Now on our local machine, this is causing problems because this is getting loaded before the form has actually been read. And you can't control how slow or fast this is going to happen. And there's a few ways, and I'll show you a couple of ways to change this. But the most obvious way that gets rid of the problems in almost all cases is to actually just cut and paste it just inside the body. So this is why most HTML pages keep the scripts at the bottom of the document, so that they are read after all of the markup has been shown on the screen, to prevent this weird timing problem. If we come back here and refresh, we'll see that it worked. The form is gone because the form existed in the document before we tried to manipulate it. So next, let's talk about not only manipulating the document, but how to interact with our users through events. Now let's talk about JavaScript events. Let's open the index.html page, and let's find that button for buy. And let's go ahead and give it an ID of buy button, for lack of a great name. I'm just going to copy that name so that I can use it in a moment. And over here in the form, I'm going to go ahead and get the button in the same way, document.getElementById, buy button. But this time I want to be able to act on an event. We do that by calling button.addEventListener. And what this does is allows you to add a listener to the event. This may not be the only listener. It's much like in C# when you're adding a handler to an event. You're not being the only listener of that event, but you're adding your own handler. And you can see that the IntelliSense wants to give you a bunch of different options here. Some that work in all browsers, some that don't work in all browsers. But I know that click does work in all browsers. And the way that add event listener works is that we're going to give it the name of an event, and then we're going to give it a function that is going to be called when the event happens. And in our case, I'm just going to say alert buying item. So you'll see this pattern in JavaScript quite a lot, and that's where you're passing an anonymous function. Now we could certainly have done this like function by button handler and put some code in there and then passed it here. But more commonly, since we're never going to call this in any other case, we're just going to pass in an anonymous function. And an anonymous function is one without a name. A name normally would go here after the keyword function, but we're going to pass in just an anonymous function, much like a C# lambda. Let's see if this works. If we refresh the page and we hit the buy button, our alert fires, and we're done. So we're able to get different interactions from the page. Now, alert is such a problematic API that most browsers now say, as you open up more than one, give you a little click box to prevent you from creating additional dialogues, because it was used by bad people to keep people from leaving the page. I'm going to leave that as that, and I'm going to show the tools again, and we'll just use console write lines instead. If I change that to console.log, then here on the page, every time I click buy, it's going to add a new buying item. And we'll see that this little number over here shows you how many times it's just been repeated. It does this in some consoles instead of repeating the same item over and over and over and over again. But let's try something else. If we look at our index.html, we have this set of list items here that we could get as a collection, or we could get the parent of it and actually look at the children. And let's do it that way, because there may be other list items somewhere on the page, so getting them by the li name would work temporarily, but might be a little fragile. So let's get the product info by calling document get element by class name instead. And if you remember, we called the class here product props. Now the problem with product info now is that it's a collection of anything on the page. Even though the collection will probably only have one item, it does return a collection. So having a good way to add this click event handler means we're going to have to write some code like item 0.children, and then figure out a way in the list items to handle each of these list items and adding an event handler. And I'm not going to write this code because there really needs to be a better way. Because we have two problems going here. One is that the APIs inside the browser can be a little terse when dealing with anything but getting an element by the ID. And we certainly want to discourage you from naming everything by ID just so you can get it in an easier API. The second problem is how these APIs in the browser work change between browsers. So between Chrome and Firefox, IE, Edge, and Safari, they work in a pretty similar way these days, though it's not 100% the same API because different browser manufacturers want to do different things. But once you start throwing in the Android browser, mobile Safari, mobile Chrome, it starts to get really dense. And how do you get that same behavior on different browsers without having to check to see what browser they're on every time you find an exception? And that's what we really lived with 5 or 10 years ago. So that's why we're going to introduce the idea of jQuery. But before we do that, we're going to need to have a way to load in client libraries like jQuery for us to use in our client-side applications. So let's do that next. Let me introduce you to libman. Back in Visual Studio, we're going to need to include jQuery, which is a third-party library, into our solution. If you come to this course through ASP.NET, you might be used to using NuGet packages to pull in libraries like jQuery or Bootstrap or other client-side libraries. That's no longer supported in ASP.NET Core. There's several ways to do this. You can use something called Node Package Manager to do it. You can use other client-side package managers, like the JavaScript Package Manager. Or in our case, we're going to use a tool that's built into Visual Studio to do it. If we right-click on the project itself, Dutch treat, we can come down here and say Manage Client-Side Libraries. This is about the simplest approach, and it uses something called libman. When we do this, it's actually going to create a configuration file called libman that is going to be the container for all the information about your client-side libraries. This will restore these client-side libraries every time you load up Visual Studio. we're not going to actually use the JSON file to configure it. We're going to use a different tool. If we right-click and say Add, we're going to be given the option of adding a client-side library. This is going to allow us to pick where we're going to get these. And essentially what this is doing is looking at some popular CDNs or sources for third-party libraries, and then it downloads and includes them in your project. I typically use Unpackaged because that's the one I've had the best luck with. And so we start typing in the name of the library, which in our case is going to be Jquery. You're going to see other packages that it tried to search for and found Jquery a part of, like Jquery UI or Jquery Validation. But we're just going to pick Jquery because that's the one we want. And it went and got the latest version, which as of the recording is 3.5.1. And you can see we could include all the package contents, but usually that's way more files than we need. So I'm going to say, you know what, I'm only going to include the files we actually need in our project, which are going to be included in most libraries, it's built this way, the dist folder. That's for the distribution folder. The rest of the package includes some other pieces like the source files, the external files, and information about the package. But we just really want the actual JS and JS min files as well as the map files. And so getting that entire dist directory is fine. Notice that by default, it's going to put it in a target location inside of our www root in a folder called lib underneath the name of the library. So when I say install, underneath the www root is going to be this new lib folder with the Jquery dist, the same structure. And you'll notice that this doesn't have as many files because Visual Studio has collapsed them into a min version and a slim version. And underneath the slim version, there's actually a min as well. We're not going to use the slim version. We're going to use the min version for now. But now that we have that installed and we can see a way to add more libraries, we're going to go ahead and start using Jquery. Let's do that next. So now let's look at some basics around Jquery. Back in our index.js, we can assume that Jquery is loaded and usable for us here. And let's say we want to just look at Jquery as an object. We can type Jquery, and because it knows we've included the project, it's giving us some of the IntelliSense for it. If we type the dot after Jquery, we're going to see the API of Jquery. There's a bunch of different calls, Ajax and apply and etc. And we're not going to use many of these, but one of the interesting things about Jquery is that most of the time people aren't using Jquery as the actual API. They're using $. So if you've ever seen a lot of code that uses $, it's an alias for that name of Jquery. So we can see the same APIs are available on $, as they are Jquery. And this is a shortcut so that we don't have the word Jquery everywhere, and the size of our JavaScript file is going to be a little smaller. Because most people use the $, you're going to want to get used to thinking about that as the alias of Jquery itself. So one of the strongest things about Jquery is the way they want to find items in the document. So as a replacement for getting element by ID, you can actually use the $, and then the parenthesis on the $, says execute the default function of Jquery, and that is really querying the document. That's why Jquery is called that, JavaScript querying of the document you're dealing with. So what goes in the quotes here? This is going to be something that defines how to find this object inside the document. And what they're using here are CSS selectors. So instead of inventing a new syntax for that, they've said, you know, CSS already has a way for us to define what we're looking for. And so if we put pound the form, just like we did when we were styling with CSS, this is going to find the element with the ID of the form. And when you return this, it's always going to return us a collection as the result. So this query returns a collection that may contain one object, but it's going to allow us to execute methods on the entire collection at once. So assuming this, because it's an ID selector, is going to give us only one call, instead of setting it as hidden, we're going to say hide. Now this does a few things for us. It allows us to do more complex querying for different objects in the page, and we'll see that in a minute. But it also allows us to not care about the differences between the browsers. jQuery is going to handle your intention becoming what it actually needs to be in each browser. They're detecting which browser you're in and making sure that the hide method is doing the right thing depending on which browser you're using. In that case, I'm telling it to hide the form. And let's replace these with jQuery in the rest of these as well. So in jQuery, instead of add event listener, you can actually just say on. And the rest of the syntax is pretty much the same. We're saying on a click, call this function. Again, we're able to get this single item. But down here when we're looking at product info, we can actually just put the period because we're looking for a class called info. Again, this becomes more brief, but also allows us to look at the same syntax we're already using for CSS in order to manipulate the elements in our document. But it actually goes a little further. I can actually use full CSS Selector syntax, which would have been really difficult to do using the browser API. So here I can say, don't get me the product groups, but get me the list items inside the product groups. Because this is that same selector syntax we saw earlier when we defined the product groups here. Now I could even include the UL if I wanted to, but it's not necessary in this case. So this same selection syntax is being used by jQuery. The real magic here is that instead of iterating through the collection manually, let's go ahead and handle clicking on each of those list items. And in this case, there is a keyword called this, and inside a function inside of JavaScript, this is going to represent some object you're in. And usually that's going to be the window you're living in, or if you're working with prototypical classes inside of JavaScript, it would be the object that represents the class, much like in C#. But in this case, it's doing something special. It's binding to the item that we've clicked on. And so let's use that console.log. And let's say you clicked on, and I could use the this to just say something like inner text, which is a call directly to the browser, but inner text may not work on every browser. So instead, let's jQueryify, that's probably not a real word, but let's wrap this in the jQuery wrapper. And we do that by just putting the this pointer inside of $ and then the parentheses, which is really executing a function that returns a new object that wraps it. And then we can just call the jQuery call, which is text. If we've done this right, we could click the buy and we'll still get that buying item being written to the console. We can also click any of these items inside of our unordered list. So I click on price, you'll see it'll say you clicked on, and then it's going to pull the contents directly from the item we're clicking on. We'll try artist Van Gogh and artist description as well. The trick here is that we're setting up events on a collection of items. Remember that this products props li is going to select every item on the page that qualifies there. So every container that's product props that has a child called li. And so we're going to end up getting a collection of these list items that with one simple line, we can go ahead and set up the error handling for the entire set. And that because the function that's being called back is going to contain the item we clicked on, we can use that to get information if we want to. Let's look at a more pragmatic example. So now let's talk about some practical aspects of jQuery. One of the problems with JavaScript in general is that there's something called the global scope. And that is everything that's created here in a JavaScript file that is created at this level is inside the global scope. And so you can often have the problem of colliding names. Now, the nature of JavaScript is weird in that if the file that comes later renames the object, it's happy to deal with it. So because of these collisions in the global scope, it's often common to wrap all of your code inside of an anonymous function. Now, this is very confusing at first, in that by putting it in an anonymous function, we can actually tell it to execute as soon as it's read by wrapping the function and then putting parentheses at the end to say, not only create this anonymous function, but execute it. This moves everything out of the global scope, but everything inside of the function here is visible to each other, and so we get the same behavior without having to worry about this global scope. If you're working with jQuery, this becomes a little simpler in that what you can do is wrap the document around a jQuery object and then use a function called ready. What ready does is say, I'm going to execute whatever is in this block of code as soon as the browser is ready. This is guaranteeing wherever you've included the file or any sort of timing mismatch that the browser has told it, hey, I've loaded the entire DOM into memory before you try and execute this. Because before we did this, most likely it would work in every case, but we might have one weird case where maybe the user would go, that's weird, let me refresh the page, and then it would load because the timing issue of loading them across a network has gone away. Ready solves that by only calling this code once the page has been completely loaded and is ready for you to actually run some jQuery. So the ready takes a function that it's going to call once the document is ready. The secondary bonus to this is that all of this stuff gets hidden in its own function so that all the code inside of it knows about each other, but it's not leaked into that global scope that could have you collide with other libraries or other named variables in who knows how many JavaScript files. This is just a safer way to actually handle this. So let's quickly go to the HTML and let's build a new div that's going to contain a simple login. And so let's add a div here that just says login, and I'll just call it login toggle. We're going to use that to allow a user to show or hide the login form. So let's start with a form, and let's give this an idea as well as the pop-up form. And we'll do much what we did before. We'll have a label, username, input, and I'll just copy this 2 more times so that we have 2 other pieces. And I'll say password. And like we did before, we'll say type equals password for our password. And in this case, I'm going to actually move the label afterwards because we're going to want to use a type of checkbox. And one of the interesting things about this is it's going to allow us to put a title after the checkbox instead of before. And so in this case, I'll say remember me. And in the last div, I'll put a submit button, and we'll just go ahead and complete it there. And if we refresh this, we'll see that we get a fairly simple form here, but let's make some changes. Let's go into our site.css and do a couple of things. So we're going to say pound login toggle, and I'm going to just change the cursor to be the pointer. The idea behind setting the cursor is that when the mouse is over an item, you want to be able to show that it's actually clickable. If we refresh this, we'll see that when we get over it, it actually turns into that hand we're used to clicking, even though it's not an element like a button, which we certainly could have made this into. We're also going to want to do pop-up form, and we could define things about our pop-up form. But in fact, because this might be something we want to use later, let's go back to the index and let's actually make this into a class so that we can make more than one pop-up form somewhere in our project and it'll still represent what we want a pop-up form to look like. And the only difference here, of course, is period. Pop-up form, and I'm going to say padding 5 pixels, much like we did in the CSS. I want to bring a little bit of this all together. We're going to add a border of 2 pixels, black, and we're going to pick one of these types, and then I'm going to pick an outset border instead. And now we can see that our pop-up form now has this sort of popped out look and feel. If I change this to inset, it'll more look like it's sunken. It's a small change, but it should be enough for us to do what we want. I'm going to change its display just like we did before because we don't want it to be the entire page. We could set a width, or we can just say inline block to make it as small as all the contents need it to be. We also just want to set up pop-up form. Let me move this down a little. And we want to say input width equals, let's say 200 pixels, label, and let's make these a width of, let's say 150. Again, we're sort of guessing at these. Aside from width, we're also going to want to change this label to inline block because we want it to take the space we're giving it. If we just leave it as inline, which is what it's by default, it's only going to display its size based on the actual text. And so we need to change it to inline block. When we refresh it, we'll see here that the labels are quite big, and then we have our perfectly sized inputs. But we have two items that are also being made 200 wide, the checkbox and the submit button. So let's add one more thing to sort of solve this, and that is input type equals checkbox and input type equals submit. And here we'll just set our width to auto. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell it to make them as small as possible. Now that looks like a proper login. Now let's do the Jquery fix. Back here in index.js, we're going to want to do two things, and let me make some space down here to do them. First, conventionally, I like to get both objects that I need first. I like to do them before I start to manipulate them. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is get the ID of login toggle. And I usually like to start them with a $sign so that I know it is a jQuery object, so I can quickly see. It's not required, you don't have to do it, but it's a common pattern I've gotten used to. And then I'll do the same for pop-up form. Of course, we can't say pop-up form because the dash is more like a minus. So I'm just going to case it, and this time look for pop-up form, the actual name. Now that we have them both, what are we going to do? We're going to say login toggle dot on click. So every time we click it, what do we want to do? jQuery has some functions that ease manipulation of a display. So I can say pop-up form here, show, but then I need to know whether it's hidden or not. And so it might be weird to look at whether it's hidden, whether it's shown. I could certainly do things like CSS display equals none, which would mean that it was hidden, but that's ugly code, right? I could certainly check to see if that were the case and then do the right thing. So instead, we'll just use pop-up form.toggle. This way, if it's hidden, show it. If it's shown, hide it. Inside the jQuery, they're going to make that determination for you. So we refresh it. As we click, it'll hide and show it. That way, we have a little way to toggle this back and forth. But I would like it to be slick. In jQuery, there's also an animation stack, which is really useful. So we're able to actually tell Toggle an amount, like 1000, which is 1000 milliseconds, or if you're good at math, 1 second. If we do it now, we'll see it hide and show the way we might want to. Of course, this is the default animation. This might not be something we actually want. They also have helpers for different kinds of animations. So if I say slide toggle, I could tell it to slide in and out, which is a little slicker, or fade. Of course, you might want these animations to be faster. I'm making them fairly slow so you can very easily see them. I've only scratched the very beginning of jQuery and JavaScript, and I do suggest if you haven't used either one of them, you might want to go visit some other courses that I'll show you in a minute. Let's wrap up this module. So what have we learned in this module? I've shown you that JavaScript is not just a humble but a powerful language that is ubiquitous across a lot of different ecosystems, though we're going to focus on its use as client-side development for your web pages. I've explained how it is the language for client-side web apps, and that while other languages like CoffeeScript and TypeScript and even WebAssembly allow you to do some interesting things, a lot of them compile down into JavaScript as well. So it ends up being the source language, the language that's being consumed by the browser for your client-side web apps. And finally, I've introduced you to jQuery as a powerful tool for building your web pages. jQuery and JavaScript are really useful when you want to empower your web pages, but don't want to get into the complexity of building a single page application for every use. We are going to talk about single page applications later on in the course using Angular. There's a lot of times when you want to use simple JavaScript or jQuery to just handle small, elegant interactions with the user. Up next, we're going to introduce Model View Controller inside of ASP.NET.